Hello Year 5 and welcome to your next history lesson. So we're going to build a little bit onto the end of our last lesson where we looked at the different types of artifacts that gave us clues about the Mayan civilization. And we're going to link that into looking at a different range of evidence sources that might help us understand the Maya civilization a little bit more. Okay, so today we are going to be able to try and identify and use the range of evidence sources to help us understand more. By the end of the lesson, we need to be successful in being able to identify at least 3 different sources of evidence, okay, that link to the Maya civilization and explain what they tell you. So we're going to have to pick apart all the different information from it and be able to examine a historical picture and answer specific questions about it. Now that's going to be part of your task at the end of the lesson today. So let's discuss the following questions. If you're with your partner at school, have a go at answering these questions between you. If not, and you're at home on your own, have a think about some answers to this question and jot down some ideas. So how do we know about the history of the world? Who finds that information out for us? Where does that information even come from? How accurate do you think our representation or interpretation of the past actually is? And how do we know about the ancient Maya? So how do we know all that information? Where has it all come from? So pause the video and either have a chat with your partners or have a think and jot down some answers to those questions. Okay, we're going to explore the answer to those questions through our lesson today. So, in order for any historian to paint any form of picture about an ancient civilization or any part of history, we have to use a range of different sources, so evidence that's proof. Okay, and we then piece this all together with all of the additional details that's going to give us a strong picture or idea about something that's happened in the past. Okay, and it's a bit like doing a jigsaw puzzle. So if you want to find out what the picture is of your jigsaw puzzle, to find out some information, we need all the little pieces that we're going to put together to give us that big overview picture. Now, there's 2 different types of sources that we can use, and I know that you'll have looked at these in Year 2 and Year 3 and 4. So the 2 different types of sources we have is one, we have primary. So this is where they come directly from that point in time. So it could be a photograph, it could be an artifact, so something that's been found as part of a burial ruins or some ruins from somewhere. And then we have our secondary sources. Now, these are resources that are created after the event has happened. So this is when we are recapping or rethinking about something that's in the past. So this could be when you use textbooks or having storybooks or any drawings or pictures that people have made based on other evidence. Okay, so for example, if you think about the Titanic, so we know how the Titanic sank because we've got the newspaper reports from the day it sank. We've got evidence that was brought up from the shipwreck. We've got photographs from the day it left the port. But then we have secondary resources when we have recounts. So this is where someone's read a diary entry and has then written a recount based on that person's experience. But actually that diary entry is going to be our primary source because that's real. That's from that point in time. But that recount story or even the movie, that's going to be a secondary source because that's based on other information we've been given, okay? So what I would like you to do is you have a sheet that I've sent home to you and it is a table which has 5 boxes down the side and it has these separate questions along your titles. So if you're at school and you're doing this with other people, you can do this as a group or in pairs. Equally, you can do it on your own if you want to. If you are at home, see if you've got someone that might be there to help you, or if not, have a go on your own. Can you have a go at thinking about how many different types of evidence you can think of that might help somebody understand any part of history? It doesn't have to necessarily be the Maya, but it could be any form of history that you might have looked at before. Maybe when we've done the Egyptians, okay? Think about what different sources you had that were evidence to prove this information that we know. So what does the source of evidence actually tell us? So what do we learn from it? Is it going to be a primary or a secondary resource? And how reliable are they going to be? So I just want you to jot down some ideas into your table. It doesn't matter if you think you've got it right or wrong. This is just to have a retrieval practice of what you might already know about primary and secondary sources. So pause the video and have a go at filling out that table and then we'll come back. Okay, so here are some ideas. Okay, let's see if you've got some of the same ideas that I've got. You might even have some different ones. So if we think about it in terms of the Mayans, of what we might already know, here are some ideas, okay, of some different types of evidence we could use. We have the archaeological artifacts or the archaeological sources that we can find. So this is where we actually have remains, so bones or pieces that are dug up and analysed for then archaeologists to then interpret. So this is physical evidence that we've taken from the ground. So we know that's going to be a primary source. We then have written resources. So this is where we have evidence from written records, either from that time or recorded later. Now, if we have the evidence of the original letter written from that time, that's going to be a primary source. If it's something that's been re-recorded later after the event, this is most likely going to be a secondary source because it wasn't at that point in time that those results or resources were made. We then have maps. Same thing for written evidence. Maps can either be created in those times, so it's part of history, therefore a primary source, or it's something that's created and analysed and changed after the event's already happened. So then it could still be a secondary source, okay? So written evidence and maps could both be a primary and a secondary source. Now, looking at artwork, paintings or sculptures, now they can either be from that particular time or they could be in later in history. So if we think about our Egyptians and we're looking at hieroglyphs on the pyramids, well, that's a primary source because that's something physical, part of history that's always been there. But if we had someone that maybe painted pictures or took pictures of those hieroglyphs, then that makes it a secondary source because they're using that information based off that primary source. Now we have letters and diaries. Now letters and diaries are usually found from explorers or archaeologists who actually document their findings. So when we write a diary, that's in chronological order. So you write that diary on the day that it happens. So that's going to be our primary source. Okay, because that is information relating to specific events that happened on those specific days in the past. You can't rewrite a diary a year later based on something that happened the year before. Now, films and documentaries, these tend to be more secondary resources, okay, because they're created to piece together information from the past or to tell a story. Now, films don't always tend to be 100% factually correct. But documentaries tend to be based on the facts and information they've been given. So although they are not a primary source, they will use a lot of primary sources within that documentary to build that story. So that one can be a bit of both. And then we have our stories, myths and legends. Now we're going to be looking at one of our legend stories about the two heroes, and we're going to look at that later on in our topic. Now this can either be written at the time or it can be later in history. So this also can be either a primary or a secondary source. So we have an American explorer and travel writer, John Lloyd Stephens, and a British artist named Frederick Catherwood. Okay, now they're accredited, so they're given the credit, the acknowledgement, for reigniting the interest in the ancient Maya civilization from about 1839 onwards, okay? Now, this also links back a little bit to our Tudor topic about that whole idea of exploration of new worlds. Because of the attack on the Spanish Armada, it opened up that opportunity for the Spanish to go off and explore. And obviously we had the Spanish invaders, who were the conquistadors, who actually discovered the Mayan civilization. So you can see the links between our previous topic of looking at different exploration and how that's led the way towards finding the Mayan civilization. So these two, this explorer and travel writer came and then explored the Mayan ruins. So the ruins and these lost cities for the Mesoamerica had actually already been recorded previously when the conquistadors came and investigated. But there was a more detailed documentation that Catherwood actually conducted, and as a result, more interest around the Mayan civilization began to grow, and this is how we ended up with more exploration of the Mayan civilization. Now, there have been numerous archaeological expeditions towards the Mayan regions in North America and Mesoamerica, and a lot of them were launched based on the work that was conducted by John and Frederick. Now we're going to have a recap of what an archaeologist is, because we looked at this in our last lesson. So we know that archaeologists will use different objects and buildings that they found that people from the past have left behind, and they use this to help have an understanding of the history. So when they start exploring these ruins, they actually found a wealth of information about the Maya. So they actually began to dig deeper into the Mayan civilization. Now, the Maya city of Copan was the first to be explored by Stephens and Catherwood, okay, and they actually published a book about it. And in that book, they detailed their findings in Coppen and other places. Now, that book contains different maps, different drawings, and different texts that were written by Stevens and Catherwood. Now, this is going to be a primary source because this was written as they continued along their exploration. So, all this evidence from their drawings and their writings and their maps is first-hand primary sources that archaeologists have been able to use to understand the civilization more. Okay, now we've got some various facts on the screen. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video and let you have a quick read of those facts. Okay, so based on the information that was written and drawn in those books that they both kept as almost evidence books, we've been able to draw out this information based on the evidence that they left behind. And we've also linked in links there into language as well and architecture, so the buildings. Now, Catherwood's drawings of Coppen produced so many different details that helped people discover different parts of the Mayan civilization. Now, he used what we call a camera lucida. Now, this uses mirrors and prisms to try and superimpose the image. So it's almost like creating a shadow of the shape on the paper to allow them to then draw around it. But it also allows them to be accurate in almost their proportions. So how big it is, how big the drawing is, and what the perspective is as to where they're looking at this drawing. Okay. Now, several years later, Catherwood actually created a technique called lithography. Okay, and this is where they then print their works. This is a little bit like the printing ink that we do when we're at school. Now, this is one of the stone statues that was found. It's more than 3 meters high and dates all the way back to around 720 AD. So we're going right back towards the beginning of our Mayan civilization timeline. Now, it's thought to be one of the most famous rulers of the Coppen Mayan civilization. I am not going to have a go at pronouncing that word because I've tried it so many times and I keep getting my tongue tied. But you can see his name on the screen. It's very complicated. And he was actually believed to be the god, to be a maize god. Okay, so he's looking over the lands of the farming and the agriculture of the Mayan civilization. Now, we've got the different buildings and fragments, okay, from the sculptures and buildings and temples that were found in Coppen. Now, the remains of these sculptures weren't exactly found in this specific location, okay? But Catherwood did some drawings of them when he went back to London and used the sketches to show how he had made to draw new compositions. So he'd almost gone back and drawn those from memory. Okay, so that would make that more of a secondary source because he's relying on his memory of what they looked like, but equally they weren't recorded as being found in the location where he said they were.